Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Ferraro, a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And today I'm going to be talking about leveraging peer comparisons or social comparisons to reduce pollution. Now, I don't think it's controversial to say that we humans look to other humans for cues on how to behave. Now, the problem is that insight, like many insights from the behavioral sciences, doesn't tell us exactly how we ought to harness or leverage the insight to change behavior for the social good. Now, one way that people have discovered to harness that insight, change behavior, is through the use of social or peer comparisons. And these are messages sent to people that contrast their behavior to the behaviors of others and sends a signal about what the desired behavior is in that particular context. So up on the screen here, you can see examples from energy conservation and water conservation, examples that you may have received in your own mailboxes. And these peer comparisons have been tested in randomized controlled trials, tens of randomized controlled trials, with thousands of people in natural settings. And in most of these cases, the groups that receive these messages, on average, do more of the desired behavior than groups that don't receive the message. So less energy and water use, more savings, more charitable giving. They don't produce large effects like most behavioral science inspired interventions. They're modest effects, about a 3% change in behavior with some range depending on the context and the population, but they're cheap to implement. And all you need is some administrative data on people's behaviors. So it makes sense to think about using these peer comparisons in the context of reducing water pollution. And the problem is that when you think about water pollution, you're largely thinking about facilities that are discharging waste into water bodies. And most of the evidence that we have about the impact of peer comparisons is coming from consumers, not from producers. And there are reasons to believe that this evidence base won't necessarily extrapolate to these producing facilities, these polluting facilities like municipal wastewater dischargers or industrial dischargers. Why not? Because they have a lot of attributes that in prior studies have been shown to lead to decisions that look more like the rational choice models from economics than the boundedly rational decision makers from psychology. So for one, the people who are running these facilities tend to be experts in their domains. They're making the same decisions over and over again. They're highly experienced. The stakes of these decisions are very high. They're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars, not the tens of dollars that are typically at stake when talking about energy conservation or about charitable giving. These facilities are all facing cost pressures, whether it's coming from government or coming from markets. And they're typically making decisions as groups of individuals, not sole individuals by themselves. And now, even if the intervention still works in these contexts, despite these attributes, we have the problem that these organizations might be long-lived, but the people within them are not. We have staff turnover. So even though you might be able to change the behavior of staff who are there now, they leave, and the staff that replaces them may not have the same behavioral change that were experienced before. To see whether or not these peer comparisons can work in the context of polluting facilities, Dietrich Ehrenhardt at the Kansas University and I worked together to run an experiment with over 300 operators of municipal wastewater facilities in Kansas. We randomly chose half of them to receive peer comparisons, and the other half didn't receive anything. We constructed those peer comparisons using data from the EPA, where we compared the facility's discharges of a particular pollutant to the discharges of other facilities in the state. If you want to see what these letters look like, you can go look at the article that's on the screen. But suffice it to say that it showed them how their behavior compared to other wastewater municipal facilities in the state. And it's really important to test these ideas in experiments, not just because of the attributes we saw of facilities that may make them less prone to being affected by these peer comparisons, but also because there's still a lot of debate about how these peer comparisons work, what mechanisms are operative when they change behavior. And in the context of polluters, it's possible that depending on which mechanisms are operative, that these peer comparisons can increase pollution rather than decrease pollution. So it's really important to test these ideas rather than scaling them up based on what we see among consumers. Right, so what did we find? Right, we looked after the intervention for 10 quarters, or 30 months. We looked at the pollution behavior of those who received the messages and those who did not. Prior to the messages being sent out, there was no difference in their pollution. After the messages were sent out, we see that the recipients of the letters are polluting 7%, discharging 7% less than those who didn't receive the messages. And interestingly, it seems like the bigger polluters are the ones that reduce more. Now, because of the sample size, it's no easy estimate. The margins of error are large, so we can't get a handle exactly on the magnitude by which the bigger polluters respond more, but it does seem like they respond more. Also, and importantly for sustainability, the effects that we see don't seem to wane over time. Right? The effect that we see in reduced pollution is the same in the first 5 quarters as it is in the last 5 quarters. This persistence finding is really important because in the behavioral sciences, when people have bothered to look at what happens after the intervention stops, in the social comparison context, we see very quick and very substantial waning of the impacts. So in this figure up the top, we see experiments that were done in rule compliance, charitable giving, savings, voting. When the messages stop, we see a very dramatic decrease in the behavior change that was observed right after the people received the peer comparison. In the bottom panel, which is in energy and water conservation, we don't see as dramatic of a waning. And recent evidence suggests that's because in those contexts, there are opportunities for people to adopt technologies or process controls that allow them to make the action and not have to think about it afterward. They call these one and done decisions. You make it once, and then the effects on behavior persist indefinitely. And in the water pollution context, right, polluting facilities, they have a lot of technologies and process controls at their disposal. And so we might expect to see persistence in this context. In fact, when we look at the data that we have available, we look at the context from other cases, it looks like that it's investments in facility processes rather than changes in habits or behaviors of the staff that's driving the reductions that we see in this context. Now, before you go scaling this intervention up, there's at least 3 things that we need to point out. First thing is we need to replicate that experiment at larger geographic and sectoral scales. We need more states, we need more types of facilities, particularly private industrial facilities. We're in the process of doing that replication right now. Second, in the United States and a lot of other high-income countries, polluting facilities self-report their pollution, just like you self-report your taxes. That makes it difficult when you're using administrative data to look at the impacts of these peer comparisons to know whether or not the peer comparisons are changing actual pollution or if they're changing what facilities report that they're polluting, if they're affecting their strategic reporting rather than their actual processes in the facility. We need to find ways to be able to differentiate between those 2 behavioral effects. And lastly, it's really clear that these are cost-effective ways to change behavior. But we're not sure that in the aggregate, overall, that they increase social welfare. And that's because we don't know exactly what's going on inside the businesses or homes where the behavior change is happening. In order to know whether or not we've improved social welfare overall, we really need to have a better idea of what exactly is being done and is it welfare optimizing. Overall, if you're looking for inexpensive, cost-effective behavioral intervention that's likely to have an effect on water pollution among polluting facilities, peer comparisons are a good place to be looking. They deserve a closer look. Now, if you have any questions about anything I said today, feel free to reach out and contact me. I'd be happy to answer your questions. You can reach me through Twitter or through email. Thank you for your attention.